And the topic of today's lecture is project communication management. And like there is, I suppose this is really truistic and kind of crude description of what is going on, but communication is the process of transferring information from one person to another without any loss of meaning. And a more kind of truistic way of saying it is that I say something or write something, you read it, and then you can read my mind or have an insight into what's in my mind. So that's nice, all well good. But with respect to project management, we have to recognize that communication is essentially the lifeblood of the project and project management. So the blood needs to be kind of moving around the project, which is the body of the project, really. Any blockages or any issues with the circulation of communication with the project is going to probably lead to some problems. It's challenging, I suppose it's challenging because when somebody is saying something, they are trying to convey a message, but that message, while it's being transferred through a medium of communication, is also picking up a lot of noise. And that noise is also being received by the receiver of the message, which is a problem because the noise might distort the meaning. And so the kind of noise that actually might affect the understanding of the message that's being transformed or attempted to be transformed could be things like differences in culture, some biases, lack of trust, different language use, different education levels, different mindset and perception of things. All those few ideas. There are many more. They can all skew how the receiver understands the message, and also can affect how the feedback is sent back to the originator of the message, which in turn might totally distort the communication. Essentially, you can think of it as a really long chain of Chinese whispers. But in this case, the objective of the Chinese Whispers game is not to have fun, but to produce a product or a service upon which depends the lifeline of the company. So, this is it's important to understand the how crucial and critical communication is to the success of the project. And that's why it's usually said that communicating is probably one of the most important, if not the most important skill of a project manager. And it can be probably presumed that most of the time of the project manager is spent communicating. But I suppose one thing to recognize in this case is that communicating is not the same as speaking. Because, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I think of something, then I make noises, I make air vibrations with my voice box and my voice strings, and the air vibration is transferred through medium of air or whatever other medium, if it's not voice, to you. You receive that medium in a appropriate channel. You will receive that transmission in appropriate channel, and then process it in order to read my mind. Obviously, that process might not result in the transference of the same meaning as I intended. As here an example, the person at the hairdresser wants to have a haircut with the cut over the ears, so kind of behind the ears. That's what they think. They communicate with the barber, and the barber picks it up as a really short haircut, which is a completely I suppose completely inaccurate representation or understanding of what the customer requires. So in this case, communication was unsuccessful. There are many mechanisms in which the communication can be exchanged. So, for many, I suppose many of the project people, the most typical one would be in written form, and probably something like mostly informal written form through emails. There could be some, some spoken words, gestures. Again, we need to recognize the importance of body language. We can use media, and media, I think, like video is becoming more and more prevalent in communicating between project teams, especially in the current climate where the remote working arrangements are dominant. We need to recognize that some of the communication can be formal and informal, and that we need to be careful about the words we use. And we'll talk about some of the ideas around it in a little while as we understand what project communication management entails. And I suppose the thing to note here about project communication management is its importance to the project lifetime, and how the information flows and is received throughout the project life cycle, and how it's important to see the communication as integral part of project planning. Um, that in project communication management, project manager and the stakeholders will develop an appropriate communication strategy for the appropriate stakeholders, appropriate time, using appropriate medium. That when that strategy is developed, that it's being implemented, and then why it's being implemented obviously has to be controlled, because this is project management. And if it's project management, then uh, obviously we need to be monitoring something. And fundamentally, communication is going to be based on the clarity of the purpose of the communication, understanding who the audience are and what are the needs of the audience, and our ability to control what we're communicating and how we're communicating it. Obviously, we can understand and note some of the important barriers to the communications, and those could be barriers in transfer between people, between the sender and the receiver, emotions, values, inability to listen accordingly to the needs of individuals, or communicate according to the needs of individuals even. Differences in education, and associated with that, we can have difference in understanding of meanings of terms, socioeconomic status and biases, as well as racism, which I think is culturally, what's the word, relevant right now. And then diverging priorities. If your priority of communication is to make sure that I understand we're running behind, and my priority of communication is that you understand that I had a great weekend, then we're not going to communicate very well. We have different priorities. Obviously, barriers that are physical also make a difference to how we communicate and how the communication results appear in front of us. The most important ones being literally things that prevent efficient transfer of the message across the medium: distance, noise, wall, phone static. Um, but also our issues with email and print, and lag. So I think at this stage, every single one of us had the experience where we were in a meeting online, and we had this breaking up of voices, which is a very disconcerting and um, I guess defeating thing. It prevents communication. Anyway, we're going to recognize that communication exists in a number of different forms: written, verbal, spoken, informal, formal, and so on and so forth. We're going to look at the dimensions of the communication, the types of the communication, the internal one, which centers around communicating with stakeholders within the organization; the external one, which centers around communicating with the stakeholders outside of the legal boundaries of the organization. So, if you're working for a large organization and you're talking to manufacturing team members that operate on a different continent, you're still communicating internally. But if you're talking to a company next door neighbor, even though that person is 10 thousands of miles closer to you in physical sense, In communication sense, we need to be recognizing that these people are external to the company and we have to tailor our communication accordingly. Communication could be formal, so it has some evidentiary aspects of it and can be used for the direction of the project and as reference points. And more importantly, evidence should litigation occur. So things like contracts, like agendas for meetings, action items for meetings, and so on. It could be also informal, which is usually carried out in order to understand something, to pick up information from other people, find facts, solve problems, build relationships and trust. And emails are informal most of time. The direction within which the communication operates, so it could be upward, where you're communicating with stakeholders with higher power, or higher in the decision-making hierarchy, or downwards, where you're communicating with stakeholders who have less power and are at lower levels in the decision-making hierarchy. Or it could be horizontal, where you communicate with your peers. Obviously, it could be written or oral, um, where it's kind of self-explanatory. Written is when you communicate in writing, like a report or an email, or you communicate orally. You can go talk to people. You can have a presentation, have a meeting. You can communicate in person, where stakeholders are nearby to each other so that they can literally observe each other's bodies and each other's presence, or it could be virtual, when the communications with stakeholders is carried out when they're not in the same physical location. So you have to use tools for distant communication. And this is how Zoom in recent years had become a critical infrastructure for communicating. And communication is needed to develop relationships necessary for project success. And we have to be cognizant of, I suppose, aspects of communications that are going to contribute to success of the communication process. Things like grammar, spelling, being precise with in how we communicate, the logical flow of ideas, the purpose of the communication and the flow of those ideas, the awareness and the communication skills. So all of those are quite critical. And then within the communication skills, persuasion, conflict resolution, and so on. Those kind of rules of 5 C's of written communication can be summarized as follows. That we should aim to have correct grammar and spelling. We should provide concise expression and remove uh, redundant words. Kill your darlings, as some authors used to say, words that are not necessary. We like, but we don't need them. We need to have clarity of purpose and clarity of expression. We should coherently and logically structure our ideas so that they flow. A good example in a written communication would be that there is an opening paragraph, development of ideas, and a summary paragraph, and that one idea is contained within one paragraph only, and that every the paragraphs are of appropriate length, and an appropriate length for a paragraph of written text is probably no longer than 200 words. It's about half a page, a little bit less than half a page. So I suppose that's useful to recognize, and that when we're communicating, we're controlling how the ideas flow. Obviously, there are some challenges, and more often than not, um, they're kind of a lot of them are prevalent now. So it's definitely use of virtual teams, which are very cost effective, because you can have employees work on the project without having to have them in a single location. It's challenging to provide clear and precise communication. So that's something that needs to be recognized, and it's being seen right now. And as more people move to virtual platforms and grow their understanding of the virtual platforms as means of communication, this should become less prevalent. Obviously, use of social media it's becoming is becoming, it's kind of weird to say because everybody's on social media now, so has become um, something that changed how we network and build relationships. And we need to understand that and adapt, I guess, to communicate on social media and to build networks and relationships on social media professionally on LinkedIn, um, but also probably Facebook and so on. And one thing that needs to be seen as a difficulty with communication at the moment is the choice fatigue because of the availability of different options. And I suppose it's kind of difficult to predict, to expect that a single tool will do everything that we want. And noticing that the tool doesn't do what we want might lead us to believe that another tool would be better, but that's necessarily the case. And normally we can expect that something that we have been using for a period of months is probably going to perform equally as well as a different tool a month later if we tried a different tool and stuck with it for a month. So in any case, project managers must be capable of making choices within this big bag of available communication platforms, communication mediums, communication technologies, so that the ones that they select is the best suited um, to project environment and conducive to project success. Now we have three processes in this knowledge area. One within planning, so that will be planning communication management. One within execution process group, which is managing communication. And finally, one within monitoring and controlling process group, monitoring communications. We plan, we execute, and we control. Standard process project management approach. So the first aspect of dealing with uh, communication management is planning communication management. And so, planning communication management essentially provides us with answer to a question on what to communicate, when, with whom, in what medium, how frequently. So, it really provides us with a precise definition of how we should be communicating within the project. It becomes important if our project has a large team, and let's say that within the team we have 5 team members, and each of those team members can communicate to a different person. So I'll just draw a quick diagram here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 team members. Each of those team members can communicate with a different person, but they can communicate with each other as well. So with 5 team members, you can see that we have um, 10 different channels of communication: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So, five channels for, 10 channels for 5 people. Probably not so bad. I mean, it's not such a big problem. But we will notice that the number of channels, so the number of ways in which an individual can communicate with every other individual, number of channels within a team consisting of 10 people is equal to 45. If there are 50 people within a team, the number of channels is 1225. And the general pattern follows the relationships of n minus 1 multiplied by n over 2, where n is the number of people. So if you have 50 people in your team, there are 1225 ways that how they can communicate between one another. So I just want you to pause and think for a second on the possible availability of ways of miscommunicating and how easy it is for rumors to spread. Because if a piece of information travels within channel 1 and it's a piece of information that might get distorted going through channel 7, by the time it arrives at channel 21, it completely lost its original meaning and is probably going to be contributing to project success in a negative fashion. So that's why we need to be thinking about thinking about the project communication and plan for project communication, we need to be essentially minimizing opportunities for miscommunication, especially if there are many different ways in which people can communicate within our project group. So what we're going to consider, actually, this is that's another demonstration of the relationship. With 1,000 people in the within communication channel, there are 500,000 ways in which they can communicate with one another, which is a lot. I guess we probably shouldn't really think about any groups of people greater than 150, because this is our Dunbar number, and people are essentially capable of communicating clearly with up to about 150 people. But it still arises at about almost 12,000 different channels of communication, which is a lot, quite a lot. So when we're planning communication, the kind of things that we're going to be thinking about is who are the priority stakeholders, what kind of information they needed, and really who needs what kind of information. We need to figure out what is the frequency in which the information is going to be provided to the stakeholders, and what format would it be stored in, and where. Is the access going to be controlled, and so on. We definitely need to consider the method and technology which is going to be used for most of the communications of the process. We're going to have to plan and put solutions in place for cultural and political differences so that the communication can achieve its purpose. We need to decide on language if it's a multilingual project or a project consisting of multilingual stakeholders. And finally, we have to sit down and consider the number of channels and how are those channels going to be treated within this process. We're going to have 5 inputs into this project process. We're going to use 8 different tools and techniques, and we're going to produce 3 outputs. So the inputs into this project process include project charter, which lists the key stakeholders, and hopefully the key stakeholders will contribute to our understanding of what is needed for communication planning. We're going to have to provide project management plan, which mostly consists of the resource management plan and the stakeholder engagement plan, so that we understand what resources are available and when, what are their priorities. And we're also going to understand what stakeholders are the key stakeholders and how are we planning on communicating with them so that their needs are met and project success is ensured. We're going to have to include some project documents, specifically the requirement documents, which list the requirements around communications for the customers and clients. And we're also going to have to include the stakeholder register, which consists of prioritized list of the stakeholders. So that list is going to have influence on what stakeholders need, what kind of information, and how often do they need the information, so that we can avoid redundant and unnecessary communication. We're also going to include some enterprise environmental factors. So critical in this knowledge area, to be honest, the cultural differences, the languages that need to be used, the distances between the stakeholders, the medium that's available to conduct the communication process in, the local governmental regulation and the planning for communication around that regulation, and so on and so forth. And organizational process assets like templates for communication plan, like issues or communications or learnings that were documented from other projects. So anything really that the company already has in its possession that can contribute to project communication plan and make it more practical, meaningful, relevant. It's kind of pointless for the project manager to reinvent what's already been done. We're going to use 8 tools and techniques. So expert judgment, communication requirements, analysis. Expert judgment obviously is very similar to all the previous instances of using expert judgment. So anybody with expertise that can contribute to development of a meaningful communication plan. So project managers, human resource managers, communication consultants, skilled facilitators, and so on and so forth. people who can contribute in a meaningful way to the development of the communication management. So we're going to use communication requirements analysis, and this is a technique that uses the stakeholder register input to produce an analysis for which stakeholders need what kind of information, and what format does that information needs to be presented in, and how often does that information need to be broadcast to the stakeholders. It also kind of sets up the uh, basis for our understanding of the kinds of information that, if wasn't made known to the stakeholders, would lead to the project failure. Then the channels of communication have to be understood so that the complexity of communication can be simplified. Like, we always want to minimize the complexity. The sources of information that would contribute to the communication requirement analyses are essentially uh, the structural and organizational information about the stakeholders. So organizational charts, the functions, the departments within which the stakeholders exist. It could be languages and culture across the team, and so on. And there are there are also the communication technologies that can be used for the project, but the communication technology that's going to be used for the project has to be selected based on a number of factors. So we're going to look at the availability of the stakeholders and access of the technology to the stakeholders, because there is no point in selecting the most modern and most recent the communication software if one of the stakeholders doesn't know how to use that software, so to speak. We're going to see if the amount of training required makes it prohibitive for us to be using a given tool. We're going to see whether the tools that we're selecting can support certain numbers of stakeholders. We're going to see if there are any specific patterns in how the project staffing is carried out, so that we can be responsive in our communication needs and approach. We're going to look at project duration, because short-term versus long-term has different requirements and needs for communication. We're going to look at the availability of given technology and methods. We're going to look at how the project is set up, whether it's located in the same place or distributed geographically, and obviously cost of using a given technique. Now we have a large number of different communication technologies to choose, and they include but are not limited to face-to-face meetings, audio conferencing, video conferencing, email, traditional mail, snail mail as it's called, chatting and instant messaging, WhatsApps, Facebooks, LinkedIn messaging, and so on. Fax, fax. I think used less and less, to be honest, because of ubiquity of email and scanning ability. It's also social media, but also couriers if messages need to be carried out in person, fast and with minimum level of obstructions. So we have a lot of choices to make, and we're also going to consider the communication model. So the way in which the communication is, I guess, considered, how the communication is being carried out. And there are really two communication models that are considered within the project management. So the first one is sender-receiver, and in sender-receiver, it's very straightforward. I think we've seen this in one of the original slides, where let me just go back to this. We're in send receiver, where the sender sends a message and then receiver essentially receives that message, transform or decodes this message into meaning, and then that message is then another message really is sent back, so that the original sender can decode it and figure out the meaning. Now, some improvements on that method is is added to a sample interactive communication model. So we have encode, transmit, decode, acknowledge, and respond. Um, so we have sender. Sender encodes the message. He transmits the message. Receiver receives the message, acknowledges the message, and then responds, and so on. So, like, really, this isn't really that important for project planning, as long as we have an idea that there is a sender, there is a receiver, there is a process of message transmission, and the message can be acknowledged or not. Now, the key consideration in this case is that it's the responsibility of the sender for the transmission and the interpretation of the message. So if you're the person who transmits the message, who wants to carry out some information about any aspect of a project, or you have something to share with your stakeholders, it is your responsibility that they receive your transmission and they interpret it according to your design. It's absolutely not the other, like, absolutely, I guess, it's kind of picking absolutes, but according to project management philosophy, it's not the receiver is not responsible for misunderstanding of the communication, which I suppose would for me anyway, it kind of put in context some of the occasions in which the communication didn't go for me as I planned to, and really highlighted to me the need to be more clear, concise, and to ensure that the transmission occurs as it should. Now, we're talking about all these approaches to communications, but I suppose we can finally come to the bread and butter of what the communication might be within those. So that we have interactive communications. You can have pull communications, which is the kind of communication where a receiver receives the communication on demand. So receiver demands communication. Or you could have push communication where it's transmitter, the person who transmits communication, creates their transmission pressure. A good example of push communication is a telephone. So, like, you hear a phone ring. You didn't want this to happen at that given time. It's a design of the person who is calling you. Whereas within pull communication, you are responsible for making decision that you require some sort of information. And obviously, interactive means that at the same time, both the transmitter and receiver will take part in take part within this in this communication process, and those communication methods again could include but are not limited to notice boards, newsletters, letters to staff, press releases, reports, emails, web portals, phone calls, presentations, group meetings, focus groups, face-to-face, both formal and informal, consultational, social media, and so on and so forth, many more. So these are the kind of methods that could be used in planning for the communication. Now, obviously, we're going to have some meetings because they are needed among the project team members and stakeholders to make sure that the communication needs are understood, that the decision is made on the communication methods and communication technologies for this project at hand. So kind of approaches that can be taken to communication are interpersonal communication, where you have one-on-one, small group communication where you have meetings and workshops. It could be public, where you have a single person addressing a large group, so that's kind of broadcast. You have mass communication, where there is hardly an interaction between sender and receiver. So a person or a group of people can send a message using mass reach technology. So that could be something like a mass text that you receive on Saturday night or something such. You can use social media networking as well for the kind of to approach your communication again. Now, obviously, we're going to have to apply some communication and interpersonal and team skills. So there are three that are critical in this case. The first one is the communication style assessment. And that technique focuses on trying to understand the communication styles of the stakeholders, so that you can communicate with those stakeholders that is most suitable to them. And not doing this might be dangerous, especially with critical stakeholders um, that are not unsupportive or neutral. If you remember the stakeholders attitude matrix. Now, like, you need to think about the cultural differences here. So dealing with people in East of Asia might create a specific need for communication style assessment and behavior. For instance, the culturally within the meetings, the rituals of uh, business card exchange and so on, all important for those stakeholders. Political awareness should help the project manager to make realistic and practical communication plans, rather than being producing something that's an idealistic one but wouldn't work. Um, every company has locations where there is more power than in others, and these places must be taken into consideration while organizing a communication plan, so that the power levels are respected. The project manager also should consider at least different ways of communicating with the stakeholders with different power levels. You also have to uh, have a little bit of cultural awareness, or use cultural awareness technique to prevent the biggest source of conflict and misunderstanding in projects that take part across country borders. Because obviously, if you're collaborating with, let's say, French would be easy. I mean, Ireland has a very cosmopolitan culture, so I suppose you would have to go all the way towards Middle East in order to really find culture that is much different than ours here. So you can't use Irish culture as a benchmark for their culture, because that might result in the in the destruction of trust, and possibly project failure. Need to be cognizant of that while planning for communication. Finally, we're going to use some data representation techniques like stakeholder engagement matrix, so that we understand the gaps between the current attitude of stakeholders and our desired attitudes of stakeholders to the project, and that so that we can inform how we're going to plan for the communication. And then that's it for the tools and techniques. We're going to produce three outputs. The first output is going to be the communication management plan, which is one of the subsidiary plans that make up overall project management plan. There are 10 of them. The plan should be formal, and it should be documented, especially if project is medium size or large, whatever that definition is for your organization. And if the communication channels are numerous, so it also should be documented, so that it can act as a reference point, while the communication is being managed. Um, so things that go into the communication management plan should include the needs of the stakeholders, the methods and the technology that will be used for communication, the format of information and the frequency of the information transfer, the responsibility assignment, so who's responsible for transfer of what kind of information, groups of stakeholders and their priorities, the storage methods, the recording methods of the communication, the escalation, so chain of command, glossary of the definition and terms, and how we are going to deal with changes to the plan. So there should be some sort of a change management plan for this particular process as well, or at least reference to the change management plan. Now, once uh, once we produce a management plan, communications management plan, and project commences, communications are going to start happening, and we're going to have to start managing communications as project managers. So we're going to execute the communication management plan so that the stakeholder communications needs are satisfied. And we're going to deal with the ad hoc requests for project information by stakeholders so that it's communicated to them in the manner, format, and frequency that they require. This process goes beyond, obviously beyond the distribution of information, but also makes sure that the information is recorded, stored, analyzed, and so on, presented as well. And there are a number of techniques that could affect it. They include what we consider the model of communication. What media do we choose for our communication? How do we write? How do we deal with meetings? How do we present? How do we facilitate? How do we listen? And many others. So definitely things that um, things that are going, things are going to be getting difficult maybe for some of us if we don't have the required communication skills. Listening skills, the understanding of culture and cultural considerations, understanding of body language, the understanding of other people's emotions, or being able to tune in and tune out, the skills in operating language and choosing the appropriate words for appropriate situation, and so on and so forth. And what needs to be highlighted, and again, I think this has been beaten to death, but it's still an interesting factoid that words are only 7% of the message. Tone is 38. Tone of the language is about 38, and body language is about 55 of the message. So it kind of, I suppose, is for me, it's a little bit depressing to think about is that only about 50% of the meaning that I'm trying to convey to you at the moment is transmitted, because you're not really able to see my body language right now. But that kind of understanding this breakdown of the meaning per communication channel uh, suggests that we should prioritize face-to-face communication first, after which we should focus on the phone call and only then get after emails as a way of communicating. We're going to input 5 items into this process. We're going to use 7 tools and techniques, and we're going to output 4 items out of this process. So inputs include project management plan, which for this process I think includes mostly plans that are needed to communicate. So things like communication management plan, the resource management, the stakeholder engagement plan, and so on. The documents include a change log that would contain the approved and rejected change requests, and how those change requests should be communicated to the stakeholders. The issue log that would contain various issues recorded at any given points in time in the project, and the stakeholders needs to understand those issues. Also lesson learned register, so that we continue picking up information and learning as we go through the project lifecycle, and we don't make the same mistakes again. Quality reports that would contain information about specific KPIs and that might be needed to be communicated to some specific stakeholders. Risk reports, again, would contain information about risks, risk responses, sources of risks, and so on, and uh, might be needed to be communicated to specific stakeholders as well. And last but not least, the stakeholder register, which essentially lists all the stakeholder groups, their priority, their current relationship to the project, their communication needs and communication frequency, and so on and so forth. So anything that informs communicating with the critical stakeholders. And we're also going to input work performance data. So this is the information that will be communicated to the stakeholders. 7 tools and techniques include the communication technology and communication methods, and those have been already covered in the previous slides. We're also going to use the communication skills. So these are essentially the communication skills that project managers and project team members should have in some meaningful degree, so that the communication that they carry out is effective. Those skills include communication competence. So that's how clear you are in what you communicate, how driven you are towards achieving the communication goal, how acutely can you notice different relationships between the communication and communication objectives. So it's kind of being tuned in and having a clue, really. Feedback, which is essential to any kind of interactive communication, so that you can recognize whether the communication was a success and not, and then based on this information can adjust the trajectory of your communication to achieve the communication success. Ability to communicate non-verbally, so that the meaning communicated non-verbally does not counteract or contradict the meaning communicated verbally. And one thing to recognize over here is that humans have this thing called micro gestures, I think, which are fleeting expressions by human face, which we aren't aware that we're making, but eyes of people we communicate with can pick up and recognize if people are trained. So we need to be very acutely aware of our reactions to communication, so that we don't miscommunicate, I guess, because even unwittingly, people can read us much better than we expect. And also presentations that are important for communication, you know, so from slide based to conversation based to written and so on. And at the end of the day, we need to communicate things to groups of stakeholders at a given time, and we need to make sure that when we present information satisfies the stakeholder communication needs. Project management, PMIS, project management information system, is an umbrella term given to a collection of tools that facilitate project work in organizations. And in this case, it would be facilitating the storage, organization, and retrieval of information. Things that are cloud-based, that are paper-based, and so on and so forth, that are integrated into project environments that are outside of the project environments. Doesn't really matter, as long as you can access information, pull it out, and to support your communication needs. PMIS is doing its job. Project reporting is about collecting project reports on health and other aspects of the project and putting those together so that they can be sent to appropriate stakeholders as per communication management plan. And obviously, different stakeholders need different level of reporting, accuracy, and so on. Now, we're also going to use some interpersonal and team skills like active listening, like conflict management, like cultural awareness, like meeting management, networking, political awareness, and so on and so forth. And as we complete this, we're going to output project communications. So essentially everything that we communicate, information reports, emails, verbal communication, and so on and so forth. Anything that's being transmitted from the sender to the receiver via an appropriate communication channel as project communication. Again, as per communication management plan. Also, some ad hoc communications and some ad hoc information requests are going to be communicated using project communications. We also might have some project management plan updates. If we need to update communications or stakeholder management plan, we're going to update project documents like mission log, change log, stakeholder register, if there are any meaningful changes required for those documents. We might have to update OPAs, so organizational process assets, like communication templates, reporting templates, timesheets, organizational records, whatever else. So once we are managing communication, the last but not least thing really is monitoring communications. So when we monitor communications, we are making sure that the communication management plan is executed, and that while it's being executed, it's delivering its objective, that there are no gaps that prevent communication. And if there are any gaps, that those gaps are identified and removed to ensure that the communication management plan is effective. And in a way, we have communication management plan. You communicate something to the stakeholder give you feedback and raise issues. You analyze whether feedback and issues inform you about the plan effectiveness, the quantity of information, the gaps in the communication, and whatever else, like too many meetings. Based on that analysis, you can raise a change, and then um, uh, you can process that change through the formal change process and then update the communication plan so that the communication plan, while it's being executed in the future, closes the gaps. We're going to have 5 inputs into this process. We're going to use 5 tools and techniques, and we're going to produce 4 outputs. Inputs into this process include project management plan, consisting mainly of the resource management plan, communications management plan, and stakeholder engagement plan. Obviously, those are all important issues, important documents for this process. And I think they're kind of clear why. Project documents include issue log, so documented containing all the issues raised so far by stakeholders, so that we can understand whether the issues have been solved, addressed, what was the solution and resolution of the issue, and if there wasn't any, why not. And I guess those issue logs, they're kind of repositories that can be analyzed whether some issues are cropping up repeatedly, and then if something repeats itself, there means that there's an underlying cause more often than not. Lessons learned registered, the project communications, actual things that are that were communicated, the output of the previous process, are also an input here. This is all the information about activities, the project performance, how the channels that are being used for the communication, and so on. We're also going to have the work performance data, so everything about the project or the performance of the communications management plan, so that the work being done can be performed against the baseline. Obviously, EF and OPA as per standard. We're going to use 5 tools and techniques. Expert judgment, so anyone with expertise in analyzing communication effectiveness, anybody who can contribute with their knowledge to understanding whether the communication management plan is effective, and if its effectiveness is in question, uh, with knowledge to help identify issues with the communication management plan so that those issues can be resolved. We're going to use project management information system so that we can have access to relevant data and information. We're going to use some data analysis, specifically the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix, so that we understand the gaps between the current level of stakeholder engagement, the desired level of the stakeholder engagement, whether the stakeholder engagement transitions in the direction that we were planning for. If not, why not? So that we can understand and ascertain the effectiveness of our communication management plan. We're also going to use some interpersonal and team skills and critically hear observation and conversation. So essentially, if you're a project manager, you'd walk around chatting up the project team members and check what are they up to and see what's bothering them. If you do it with open mind and open heart, you should be able to uh, see whether team is motivated. You should be able to see whether there are signs of any team conflicts or any other issues that might crop up. So you're really going down into the trenches. You're leading from the front. You're making sure that the project is in point. And obviously meetings, because nothing good ever happened without meetings, and project team members and stakeholders need to get together so that they can understand whether the communications are effective, and if they aren't, why not? And if the reason why not is identified, then the problem maybe can be resolved. As an output, we're going to produce work performance information. So this is essentially going to inform us on how well is the project communication management performing, and then we can use this to maybe monitor and control the project work. Any change requests, if they're needed, project management plan updates specifically related to the project communications management and stakeholder engagement plan, and project document updates including issue log, change log, and so on, stakeholder engagement matrix, and also project document updates, should there be any. And that concludes this presentation. So let me stop the